Hi, welcome to my presentation for the Romance Studies Research Symposium. This presentation is on the comparison of French and English Indo-Caribbean literary depictions of indentured servitude and their associated neurological implications. And this is an abridged version of my senior thesis in the departments of Romance Studies and Neuroscience. I originally became interested in researching this topic because there still is a lack of literature and research done on this population. Today, there's almost 300,000 Indo-Caribbean people in America and almost 2.5 million Indo-Caribbeans around the world, predominantly in countries like Canada, the US, the UK, Guyana, Trinidad, Suriname, and many other nations. Within my own family, which is an Indo-Caribbean family, I noticed that there's a high prevalence of neurological disorders like substance abuse, dementia, and even anxiety and depression. And I was wondering if there is a connection between their experiences in the Caribbean as descendants of migrant laborers and their modern day disease prevalence. The Indo-Caribbean population dates back to the 19th century after the abolition of slavery in the British and French empires. After the abolition of slavery, there was a labor shortage in the Caribbean and Eastern African plantations. In order to compensate for this, Indians were recruited as indentured laborers to work in these plantations and were brought to either the Caribbean or Eastern Africa to compensate for this labor shortage. This practice of recruiting Indians as indentured laborers existed from 1838 to 1917, leading to the displacement of over 1 million Indians. This diagram demonstrates the migration of Indians throughout the British, French, and Dutch colonies from the 1830s to 1917. There is little literature on the Indo-Caribbean experience and any clinical effects of indentured labor generationally in this population. The majority of Indo-Caribbean stories have been passed down orally and are easily influenced from generation to generation. But in order to understand multiple vantage points from this population, I decided to study different novels from an array of different countries in order to understand the Indo-Caribbean experience as authentically as possible. The novels I studied ranged from V.S. Naipaul's A House for Mr. Biswas to Lakshmi Prasad's Butterfly in the Wind, and explore countries like Trinidad, Guadeloupe, and other Indo-Caribbean nations. One of the key themes that I noticed throughout these novels was social defeat. And social defeat is scientifically defined as the physiological and behavioral effects of hostile interactions between two or more animals, or humans in this case, potentially generating consequences in terms of control over resources, access to mates, and social positions. This was specifically seen in V.S. Naipaul's A House for Mr. Biswas. In this novel, Mohan Biswas is the protagonist, and his life goal is to gain his own property and eventually be financially independent to provide for his own family. He is the grandchild of indentured servants that originally migrated from India, yet over the two generations that passed, he and his family are never able to establish themselves financially. Throughout the novel, he does try many different occupations and even does gain his own land from time to time, but between many different complications, from having his house burned down to having customers from his business not pay him on time, he's never able to actually establish himself financially. These social barriers prevent him from achieving his goal throughout his life, and he eventually dies consistently depending on his in-laws for financial stability. However, he does find some sense of solace knowing that his children were able to gain an education in the UK and eventually support themselves. This shows social defeat because he consistently has to depend on others and is never able to find fulfillment within himself, even though he is at times so close to achieving his goal. Another key theme that I saw in these novels was dehumanization, and dehumanization is defined as viewing someone as lacking the essence of being human, and it's often how scientists decide how inhumane actions like genocide, torture, and even slavery are neurologically justified, and how we can commit very inhumane things against other humans. Horreur is a novel about an Indian couple from different social circles who elope and eventually migrate to Guadeloupe as indentured servants to start a new life. Throughout this migration pattern, and even as their time as indentured servants, they experience varying degrees of dehumanization, from being coerced to migrate without fully knowing where they're going or what their jobs will be like, to facing mortality throughout their migration. Statistically, 13% of men and 19% of women died during their voyage from India to their destination. In this novel, Rama, the protagonist's lover or life partner, Sarah, and their unborn child actually pass away during their voyage to Guadeloupe. And like many other Indo-Caribbeans, he's left without social support or an ability to return to India after this happens on the ship, and he has to still abide by his contract and work as an indentured laborer for at least 5 years just to have food and shelter to live in. Intergroup bias was the third theme that I saw that was very pervasive throughout these novels. An intergroup bias is scientifically defined as the belief that members of social groups share inherent and unchangeable traits that remain true of group members even when their physical appearance changes. During the 19th century, the Caribbean was one of the most diverse regions of the world because there were European colonists, indigenous populations, recently emancipated African slaves, and Indian and Chinese indentured workers. Because of this mixture of different races and ethnicities, there was heavy racial bias, especially in the plantation labor system, because each race group was commonly associated with a particular role. This continued throughout the rest of the 19th and 20th centuries, and we're seen in novels like Valmiki's Daughter, where Viveka can practice on a local volleyball team because practices were where nearby black men frequented. And this was seen as not ladylike to be associated with people with darker skin than you because of their former roles as slaves. In addition, Nayan, a family friend, is glorified for marrying a white French woman who becomes a Trinidadian socialite because of the fairness of her skin and because she represents the European race in the Indo-Caribbean colony. Both Indo-Caribbean and Afro-Caribbean populations are marginalized by the white population, but they never seem to be able to get over the bias between each other and have often caused conflicts, even leading into the 1960s and 70s following the independence of these nations from the British and French empires. Intersectionality was the theme that I really wanted to investigate throughout this project because it represents a lack of protection for people that represent multiple minority groups. Traditionally, this was looked at for black women in the US that lacked protection under both race and gender under the law in the 1980s. But in the Caribbean, intersectionality can also be applied to Indo-Caribbean women, Indo-Caribbean LGBTQ people, and Indo-Caribbean mixed race people. All of these groups face prejudice under colonial rule, but these specifically intersectional groups also face prejudice within their own community because of their gender, sexuality, and or race. I believe this would exponentiate their experiences with social defeat, dehumanization, and intergroup bias, and this would also influence their potential pathological effects of these biases. Marriage is the most important social construct in Indo-Caribbean society. One's worth can be amplified or diminished by their marriage, which aligns with the literary theme of the marriage plot commonly found in 19th century Western European literature. Ideally, one would marry someone of the opposite gender, same race, and same or higher socioeconomic status in order to have a socially acceptable union. In these marriages, Indo-Caribbean women were expected to be submissive and obedient to their husbands, which often led them to experience heightened levels of domestic abuse and violence, which often went unpunished or even undiscussed. In addition, LGBTQ people still face lifetime prison sentences for being openly homosexual and socially find themselves ostracized because they directly conflict with the marriage plot. In addition, mixed race people inherently violate the marriage plot because they arrive from interracial marriages, which were often criticized and not approved by families. Through noticing the themes of social defeat, dehumanization, and intergroup bias in these novels, I looked into previous neuroscience research that discussed these themes in rodent and human models. It was found that mice that experienced chronic social defeat had a higher tendency to experience substance abuse because of their increased activation of the reward network. In addition, intergroup bias was shown to influence executive function and emotional regions in the brain, causing prejudice to emerge in decision making and perceptions of others. Human subjects prejudiced by intergroup bias were also more likely to experience depression and anxiety, in addition with those who experienced dehumanization, and this was also amplified when there was a lack of social support in their environment. To conclude, dehumanization, social defeat, and intergroup bias have major influence on the Indo-Caribbean experience. These experiences predispose Indo-Caribbeans to have a higher tendency to experience substance abuse, anxiety, depression, and potentially other neuropsychiatric illnesses. However, this has not been completely proven yet because of the lack of clinical research done on this particular population. It is integral to note that future directions need to be taken in order to conduct research on Indo-Caribbean populations today to understand the nature and prevalence of mental and neurological illnesses in this population and potentially tying them to their ancestral experiences with indentured labor. Thank you again for listening to my presentation on the Indo-Caribbean experience, and I hope that you learned a lot about this population. Thank you again.